So he had been focusing on the issue of the Sufis and the deception of the Sufis. And I mentioned in a couple episodes before that Sheikh Abdullah bin Hamid Ali himself was not anti-Sufi. Also suggested that, he was a Qadiri Sufi, but I want to be clear about this, that I'm not saying that he himself was a Qadiri, because naturally there was technically no Qadiri Sufi yet in the much more formal sense as we understand it today, because Abdul Qadir al-Jīlānī was a contemporary of the Sheikh Abdurrahman ibn Jawzi, and about 40 years his senior. About 40 years his senior. And to be totally honest, the Sheikh Abdurrahman ibn Jawzi actually spent some time in prison because of some dispute related to his criticism of Sheikh Abdul Qadir al-Jīlānī, and because he was very influential in Baghdad at the time, and he was the rulers of the time that they actually had some very good opinions about the Sheikh Abdul Qadir al-Jīlānī. And so Abdurrahman ibn Jawzi was critical of him, as he was critical of other people like Imam al-Ghazālī. He was critical of the Ashʿarīs in general. But one thing that is pretty, I guess you should say, consistent with Abdurrahman ibn Jawzi is that Abdurrahman ibn Jawzi benefited from the people he criticized, right? So the people he criticized, well, he criticized Imam al-Ghazālī about his Ihya with respect to his Hadith and revelation of fabricated Hadith, among other things. But he clearly copied Imam al-Ghazālī in the sort of chapter titles, the selection, and things like that in a number of his books. And clearly he had followed Imam al-Ghazālī in those particular areas. He was critical of the Ashʿarī and the sort of indulging their sort of indulgence in spiritual or sort of figurative interpretation we call ta'wīl, but they also pretty much took a somewhat an Ashʿarī type of position in his Shubhat Tashbīh, which I translated back in 2008, so in that particular book, he pretty much is arguing similar to the way that an Ashʿarī would argue. And in the same fashion, so while he's being very critical of Sufis, he's being critical of the more extreme ideas and practices of the Sufis out of fear that the common person, the uneducated themselves, would be adversely affected by the stories which are false. Like one story we read last week related to a story about a person, or maybe an example of maybe a storyteller saying that, okay, there was a man who was so reliant upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that he went out into the jungle, into the forest. He didn't have any provisions, he didn't have any weapons, and he survived, and to display how much tawakkul this individual has, So, and he says, okay, an ignorant person who's actually on the path of Tawbah may hear that story and then go do the same thing and end up dead as a result of it. And so he says that the individual who told the story would be responsible for that death, partially and largely is because he's telling stories which have not been confirmed. And so that was one of his issues. So like towards the end of the last lesson, we were talking about how Sheikh Ibrahim al-Harbi had rejected the claim that people had walked on water before. And he said all stories about people walking on water are not authentic. And then someone may object and say, well, oh, you're saying you don't believe in the karāmāt of the awliyā. And so Ibn al-Jawzi responds, well, it's not so much about not believing in the karāmāt or awliyā. We definitely believe in the karāmāt or awliyā, but we don't believe in every claim that a karāmah has occurred, right? So that's really the point. In other words, saying that we follow only factual evidence, right? We follow confirmed claims, right? And so that's really our concern, is ensuring that this particular information that we are passing down and we are teaching people actually is sound enough for us to say that this is reliable or this is true, right? And so when I teach hadith, usually towards the start of the semester, one of the questions I often ask students is the wisdom that we find in a particular statement or report more important than the authenticity of the statement, right? And a lot of people, Muslims in general, not necessarily my students, but a lot of people, Muslims may say, okay, well, the wisdom, that's really what's more important, because it's all about you being a good person, and you reaching God, etc., connecting with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, But the problem with only being concerned with the wisdom is that that a time will eventually come when we are asked to demonstrate, what is actually essential about being a Muslim. In other words, when one asks us the question, what is it that you require as a Muslim, without which you cannot be a Muslim, right? And if we're not able to give them sound information, right, then um you won't be able to do, in other words, say this person is a Muslim, that person not a Muslim, right? So in other words, what are the essential teachings of Islam? How do we receive that information? It's through, of course, transmitted information which has been confirmed to be reliable, right? And of course, then an obsession with this, of course, can lead to, I guess you say, a denial of benefit as well, right? That we get so caught up in the form that we just completely dismiss every type of wisdom that we find in the sources, and that in itself can become a problem too, and it can make a person very sort of like abrasive and have what we call in Arabic like a hidda, right? In their character, their personality as well. And this has been sort of the pattern of the muhaddithin as well. Many of the muhaddithin, that they get so obsessed with verification of information, right, that they lose a certain type of softness and gentleness in their etiquette with people, right? Because all that really matters is whether or not the information is true, right? As opposed to whether or not there's some benefit that can be extracted from the claim itself, right? And this is why we find the muhaddithin also, right, the majority of them, of the view that it is permissible to act upon weak hadith that encourage one to do good things, right? So that's fundamentally, I wanted to sort of bring a little context back here.